intended to speak on this bill tonight, but I feel it is important to outline to my community the position I'm taking in relation to this important legislation. I can honestly say that this has been one of the most difficult weeks of my time in Parliament. I also reflect on the fact that it's just under a month away from when I made my first speech to this chamber, and what a special day that was. But it was special in a number of other ways, and most particularly because when I stood almost in this place, a few rows in front of where I am now, I talked about the fact that I stood in this place as the first openly gay man in the House of Representatives. And that was not just an important milestone for me, but I hoped it was a significant milestone for so many other Australians, particularly those that were still struggling with their sexuality and wondered whether they could achieve all that they wanted to in life. And I said in that first speech that I hoped that my mere presence in this chamber would send a signal that you could be gay and in fact be a member of the Parliament of Australia. Of course, since that time there has been so many momentous decisions that affect the community of which I'm a part. And several years later in this chamber, following the vote of the Australian people, we celebrated the passage of the marriage equality legislation. It was in fact this flag that made headlines around the world as the backdrop to that incredible scene of the member for Leichhardt and the member for Barton embracing in this chamber. And it symbolised so much of what was special about that day. And I honestly believe that there will not be a day as special for me as when marriage equality became the law of this country. I raise these issues because it is important to understand the significance of this legislation. And I want to start my discussion about the bill by saying that of course it is a no-brainer that in this country we should have legislation which prevents one person discriminating against another person because of their religious faith. It is an international obligation. It's a human right. It is simply wrong that any person could be discriminated against because of the faith that they hold dear. And I know that in the Ruddock Review of Religious Freedom in this country, that review made the point that unlike so many other nations, we, as part of our wonderful liberal democracy, provide opportunities for people of all faiths like virtually no other country. And I know that in that review, they found that religious freedom was not in imminent peril. But I also know that there are some that face discrimination based on their religion. I think particularly of minority faiths, people of Jewish faith, people of Islamic faith, perceptions among some Christians of that as well. So the concept of having a religious discrimination bill is one that makes sense. I also want to highlight the fact that in all my work as the member for North Sydney, one of the highlights has been working with so many wonderful religious organisations, from the Sisters of St Joseph at Mary MacKillop Place in North Sydney, who do so much for those in need of help, to our local religious schools. And for example, this week I'm visiting Riverview with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs to meet with their Indigenous students that they support, to the charity groups, Vinnie's, Salvos, that I've worked very closely with, to so many others. And of course, just simply to the inherent fellowship that churches and other religious organisations, synagogues and mosques provide to their adherents. So it is right that we have religious discrimination laws on our statute books, and it is an important part of our liberal democracy. But I have had concerns about this bill because it does extend beyond the orthodox provisions of discrimination laws in this country. It goes beyond simply preventing and outlawing discrimination on the basis of a person's religion and their faith. I do want to acknowledge that there's been improvements to this bill over time, and the deletion of the flower clause and the moderation of those clauses relating to medical practitioners are really, really important. But there are still aspects of this bill that concern me. And most particularly, it is the statement of beliefs clause in this bill. Human rights are a difficult issue. No human right exists in a silo. Inevitably, many do conflict. In many, we try to balance and judge competing interests and competing human rights. But my concern about the statement of beliefs is fundamentally that it extends a greater privilege to freedom of conscience based on religious views. And for me as a Liberal, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought is the most important thing in our society. And religious faith is one of those expressions of freedom of conscience. It's no more important and no less important than any other. And my concern with the statement of beliefs and the way it's constructed is that it actually puts religious faith on a pedestal above other rights in a way that I have serious problems with. But I also wanted to talk about another aspect of the legislation and the debate that's occurring today, and that's in relation to the Sex Discrimination Act. Some have said this is tangential, almost accidentally involved in the debate we're having tonight. For me, it's not, because in the Religious Discrimination Bill, we are talking about new provisions that relate to educational settings and educational institutions. And that's why, for me, we have a historic opportunity to right what I think is a significant wrong in the Sex Discrimination Act, and that is in relation to its treatment of teachers and students. And the current SDA provides that effectively someone can be discriminated against based on inherent characteristics like their sexuality, their gender, their sex, their pregnancy, their marital status. And for me, that is fundamentally wrong. They are exemptions that belong in the 19th century, not the 21st century. And that's why, for me, having the opportunity to reform the SDA as part of this debate is so important. For me, it's about teachers. And let me tell you that the hearings of the two committees that looked at this made us realise that this is not some mere academic issue. There are teachers today who love their job, who love their profession, who love the schools that they work for, who love their students, who have been sacked for things like the simple fact that they were gay. And as the son of a Christian school headmaster, I know how important those educational settings are. I understand that schools want to protect the ethos and the mission of those schools. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there is something profoundly wrong when you judge a person based on their sexuality or their gender. And that's why I believe that today we should be addressing the issue of teachers in the SDA. But I also fundamentally believe that it's an opportunity to address the issue of discrimination which is permitted in the SDA against those that we have the greatest responsibility to in our education system, to students themselves. And again, at the moment, the SDA allows schools to discriminate based on all those characteristics I mentioned before. Of course, the reality is it's uncommon for that to happen. I think of the wonderful schools in my electorate. I've spoken to many of the school principals just this week, and all of them strive to provide a supporting environment to students based on their sexuality or gender, including those that are transgender or going through the transition. But there are still some, and we've seen this just in recent weeks, that would purport, in the name of their religion, to discriminate in what I think is quite a heinous way. And I want to tell you why this is important to me, because my own journey, something I don't talk about because I'm intrinsically a private person, my own journey is a reflection of what many other people have experienced, different age, in the 70s and the 80s. But like so many of my peers, I went through that period, that long period of struggling with my sexuality, where I lived in fear of discovery, where someone simply talking about homosexuality sent me rushing in case it led to some type of exposure, where I could spend weeks after an incident, if I'd said the wrong thing, wondering whether I'd revealed myself. And that is just so debilitating. And I did that in an environment of a school that was not particularly conservative. I can never remember it preaching against homosexuality. I did it in an environment where I had such a loving family and support group of friends. But nonetheless, for people in my situation in that age, it was such an ordeal. And can I say that whilst we have improved so much, so incredibly much just in my own lifetime, I know that that is still the experience of so many Australians. There are people today that are in mental anguish because of their sexuality. There are even more people in anguish because of their gender. And we have to provide a legal environment that supports them. And part of that is ensuring that when they're going to school, when they're going to an educational institution, they do so with that struggle that might be within them, but knowing at the very least that that school cannot legally discriminate against them. That school cannot expel them. That school cannot penalise them in a way that they have a de facto expulsion because their life becomes so unpleasant. And I want every child in those educational settings, whilst it's not a solution of itself, to know that the school itself is not going to be the cause of a problem that they face. And as a Member of Parliament, one of the proudest things about being in the position that I am is that so many parents have contacted me, even about my first speech, and said we gave that to our child to help them. So many young people themselves have approached me and said, thank you for setting an example that we can aspire to. And our school settings should provide that similar support that I believe that they so desperately need. And today, there are people that will consider taking their own lives because of that struggle internally that they go through. For me, it wasn't until my 30s that I came out completely to my family. And of course, like most people, my family said it doesn't make any difference, as it should be. But that's not the case. There are people that are threatened with violence in the home and threatened with effectively exile from their families for going through that same journey. And that's why, for me, it's really about the core of who I am that is leading me to make what are some difficult decisions in relation to what I do in this chamber. And I'd like to think that my community will support me in that journey. I will be forever proud and grateful at the fact that North Sydney residents, for the first time in Australian history, as progressive as they are, said it doesn't matter what your sexuality is if you're standing for Parliament. We're going to vote for you based on your merits, not whether you're gay or straight. They were the first to do that in the country. And I am so grateful for the opportunity that they've given me as a result in so many ways, but also I hope to be an example to anyone who is part of the LGBTI community. And in that regard, I want to say that one of the things that's disturbed me most this week is the debate about transgender children. I cannot support a situation where we solve a problem for one community, but in fact enhance a problem for another. And it's a bit of a misnomer that this is actually new legislation that's putting in place something punitive. We are dealing with the existing laws which allow discrimination based on your gender and your sexuality. But the fact is that if we solve one problem and not another, by omission, we are sending a message to those people in the transgender community. And they are the most vulnerable people in our society. All the statistics show what they go through. The suicide rates, the attempted suicide rates, the mental health problems. And I cannot stand by and do anything which makes their situation more difficult, which sends anything other than a message from this Parliament, as most receive in their schools, but sadly some don't, that we want to embrace you, we want to love you, we want to support you, and we want to nurture you during what is a difficult and often challenging part of your own lives as you realise who you are and who you should be. And I just simply want to say that in these debates, there are some that are saying we can push this down the road, have reviews. Some are saying that there is something different about sexuality or gender identity. For me, and I made this point in my first speech, there is nothing different about your sexuality or your gender than the colour of your skin. And I don't believe that this Parliament would waste a second if there was some old law which said that a school or any institution could discriminate against you because of your race, and allowed that to stand on the statute books if it was discovered that in fact that law was being exercised in a way that discriminated against someone based on their creed or their colour. And for me, that's why this is important, because I said before, we know that teachers today are being removed from some schools, a minority of schools, because of those inherent characteristics. And we know that there are some schools that would effectively penalise those based on their sexuality. The case we saw in the last 2 weeks, which equated homosexuality with bestiality and paedophilia. Just disgusting. And that's in modern Australia. And that's why we have the opportunity, by supporting amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act, to address that problem in the overarching framework of what we can achieve for our educational settings through this religious discrimination bill. So I want to indicate that I will be making the difficult decision to part with my party on some of the amendments that are before the chamber tonight, and I'll speak more about those. But I've highlighted the two that are most important to me: the statement of beliefs and the opportunity to fix the SDA. It's an opportunity that I can't let go past. I could not live with myself if I didn't seek to address those issues.